Right. Yeah, my name is Okkolin. I come from Finland, from University of Jyvaskyla, and the title of my presentation is The Sense of Educational Agency through the Voice-Centered Relational Method. I will not talk that much about agency, but I will talk about one method or one tool to analyze qualitative interview data, to capture perceived and experienced educational agency that is in my study narrated by 10 highly educated Tanzanian women. However, in order to give you a rough picture of Tanzanian context, I'll show you a few figures concerning gender, education and development in Tanzania. So, if I forgot to mention, this presentation is based on my PhD research on gender, education and development. And the main idea for presenting these figures is mainly that although in primary education Tanzania is doing pretty well, the higher you go, the less you have students in general. And in the 2010 basic education statistics regarding Tanzania, there was no net enrollment rates for higher education, but from previous studies we know that the net rate for enrollment in higher education is around 1%. So out of that population who is at the age of being enrolled in higher education, approximately 1% of the population attends that level of education. From gender perspective, the decreasing trend is similar, that the higher you go, the less you have female students. There's a tiny but a growing number of female students in higher education, and from these women's stories I have been interested in identifying factors that support their educational advancement and their and construction of their educational careers. I've been interested in knowing how did they do it, how did they reach the highest level of education against all the odds and despite of all kinds of problems and barriers. There's relatively a lot of research on problems and barriers girls and women in the global south face while constructing educational careers, and based on that we know that there are social and family related problems and barriers that prevent girls' educational attainment. There are school related obstacles, etc. But instead of problems, I've been interested in supportive factors. And during the interviews with 10 highly educated Tanzanian women, we discussed about their experiences and insights concerning enabling environment, that is families, communities and larger social settings. We discussed about the school experiences, but also their personal motives and decision-making processes related to education. It's interesting that yesterday in quite many occasions we discussed about the agency structure, and having the idea behind that structure is the bad thing, that it is the constraining factor, and that is disturbing me a lot, because to me the structure which to me can means families, communities, social settings, this sort of social and cultural structures, they can be also enabling. So I'm intrigued by the concept of structures of opportunities, and that's quite an essential element in my work. That what is the social setting? Is it enabling? Is it structure of opportunity, or is it constraining structure? Now, so that's what I have been doing and how I have been working during the analytical stage of my research. I have applied voice-centered relational method to analyze interview data. Why? Two reasons. Firstly, because of the analytical potential to examine agency, that is the core concept in my research. And secondly, because of the reflexive element that is embedded in this method. The VCR method was first developed within a psychological paradigm and applied as a listener's guide to ask and answer three interrelated questions. Who is speaking under what circumstances, who is listening, and what is the nature of listener-speaker relationship? And literaturally, the voice of participants lies at the heart of this method, and it directs the researcher to exercise intensive listening not only during the interviews, but while reading and listening the interview transcripts. I have built in practice my analysis on sociologically oriented work of Natasha Mauthner and Andrea Duché, and applied four differently focused readings for my transcripts. To start with, the first reading is two-sided, so in that sense we could talk about 5 differently focused readings. But first of all, I listened the overall story by asking who is telling what story, aiming at capturing main events, main actors and relationships, repeated words, themes, key images, and possible inconsistencies regarding their narratives on their educational experiences at homes, at schools, etc. And alongside the narrative, I asked who is listening, and traced and documented my own responses to the story and to the person who is telling the story. The reflexive element of the first listening targets to locate me socially and theoretically in relation to the narrator, and it also encourages explicitly to document how my theoretical interpretations of the narratives are made. So in practice, exercising reflexivity meant documenting my preconceptions and responses to the narrator and to the story into a separate column next to the narrator's story column. And this technique allows me to examine how and where my assumptions and views might affect my later interpretations regarding the respondent's words, and how I later write about this person. The second listening is to search for how the narrator represents herself, while the third listening traces the relationships between her and the others and the consequences between these relationships. And this is the time of the data, listening the data, when I pinpointed when and how they used the term I, we, you, they, and this is the point of analysis to identify the experienced and perceived agency and social location. Because as I said earlier, in my study the concept of agency or the sense of agency refers to girls' and women's opportunities and constraints to function in a certain structural and contextual framework. And it also refers to differences which, according to their interpretation, distincts them from the others. And the idea behind this is that much of our sense of who we are arises from who we believe we are not. And for that reason, during their third listening, I wanted to find out whom they considered others and why, and observed how the women expressed and conceived themselves and the others. During the second and third listening, I reached to understand what, in their opinion, made the difference for them to overcome educational barriers and reach the highest level of education, as the majority of others around them did not. Then the fourth listening of the VCR method is about broader social and structural settings. And in my research, Tanzania on one hand provides the macro case for the investigation, and on the other hand it contextualizes my study. And the fourth reading is the analytical stage during which the 10 micro cases are set in relation to the macro level of analysis. In other words, I looked at to what extent and how women's narratives corresponded with the strategic priorities and practices that were implemented within the recent education sector reforms in Tanzania. Okay, that's briefly about the method in practice and reflexive method. The challenges, as in research, paying special attention to the issue of reflexivity, that simply there are limitations how reflexive we can be and how far we can know and understand what actually shapes our research at the time of conducting it. And for that reason, it is only sensible to give time for hindsight. There is also a danger to oversimplify quite complex process of representing voices as if they can speak on their own, because it is always through the researcher who makes choices about how to interpret voices and what interview transcripts to present as an evidence. Still, in my opinion, this method is interesting tool to explicate and operationalize quite abstract ontological and epistemological assumptions behind our research work. As an example, this method emphasizes that as social researchers, we are integral to the social world we study, and for that reason our analytical representations are always seen as self-presentations too. I appreciate that standing and agree that my analysis and my explanation is a joint construction of knowledge that is produced through an interaction between the respondents' accounts and how I make sense of those accounts. Evidently, this leads to very subjective and situated and developmental and modest understanding of the nature of knowledge. Furthermore, I have found this method really valuable in doing research with participants who are different to my own background and in a context that is totally different to my own sociocultural and economic environment. Mautner and Daucher are somehow critical to feminist research tradition that aims at representing one's respect to difference by exploring to what extent the similarities and differences between researchers and the research participants in characteristics such as gender, ethnicity, class, or geographical location influence to the nature and structure of research relationship. But regarding the aim and purpose of my research and my research interest, as far as I understand, this method is functioning really well, and actually that is more or less all I wanted to say about that. And as I said, as I think it's working perfectly well, I'm more than happy to get comments. If how does it look and sound for you?